You're listening to the Tales of Leadership podcast. This podcast is for leaders at any phase on their leadership journey to become a more purposeful and accountable leader, what I like to call a pal. Join me on our journey together towards transformational leadership. All right, team, welcome back to Tales of Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Josh McMillian, an active duty service member and the founder of McMillian Leadership Coaching. And I'm on a mission to create better leaders, what I like to call purposeful, accountable leaders, or PALs. And my vision is to end toxic leadership by promoting transformational stories and skills and inspire others and impact 1 million lives in the next 10 years. On today's episode, I'm going to be interviewing, I would say, a good friend of mine that I've known for over 10 years. Not necessarily a friend that we see each other every single day, but someone who knew me at one of my most malleable points in my young career in the military, and that'll be Jack Ryan. So Jack currently serves as a business development director for FN American military programs that focuses on infantry weapons. Before that, he served as an active duty infantry officer, as a rifle platoon leader in Afghanistan, and as a company XO at Fort Bliss. Jack is still currently serving the military as a reservist. He lives in Northern Virginia. He is a father. He is a husband. And I'm excited to get into this episode because it is a great, authentic conversation between two individuals that knew each other at a very challenging time in both of our leadership careers. So without further ado, let's bring on Jack. Jack, welcome to the Tales of Leadership podcast, brother. How you doing, man?
Yeah, doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. So I'm excited today. I know we talked about this before, but it's not very often that I get someone that has had history with me. So you were a platoon leader when I was a platoon leader in Afghanistan, and you literally ripped out with me. So RELIP, if you're listening to this, RIP means relief in place, took over my battle, my AO area of operations. So I'm really interested to see how I messed up.
No, you definitely, you did a good handoff. I mean, and it's crazy to think, I think the last time I saw you was a little over 10 years ago in the southern end of Afghanistan, which is kind of crazy. That's the last time I saw you at all. And, you mentioned you're moving to Northern Virginia here pretty soon. So looking forward to seeing you in person and linking up in person when you get here.
Yeah, dude, it's going to be awesome. I'm excited for that next job too, that will be kind of going to transition, and it's just an exciting mission set, but
totally
kind of starting off with, for the listeners, kind of walk us through who you are.
Sure. Yeah. Where do you want me to start?
I would love to kind of what drove you into the military, those defining moments.
Yeah, that's a good place to start. I'd say I always had a strong inclination to serve from a young age. I'd say it probably started in 7th or 8th grade. It probably started with me interacting with some service members, and really holding them to high reverence. And I had a grandfather that served in the Korean War, and that kind of formed him early on in his career. He served in the Air Force and then later transitioned into the business world after that. And so, yeah, I probably started around 7th or 8th grade. And then, my first inclination was that, I was going to enlist. So I took the ASVAB, probably sophomore or junior year of high school. Did pretty good in the ASVAB, not great. But so I was going to enlist as either a corpsman in the Navy or a medic in the Army. So 68 Whiskey is the MOS designator in the Army. And then I remember this clearly. I was sitting in my junior year high school physics class, and the guy next to me was like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to join the Army too." He's like, "I'm going to do this thing called ROTC." Mm-hmm. And so I was like, "Okay, yeah, tell me about it." And he said, you apply online, you go to get your college degree first, and then you go in as an officer." And I almost didn't believe him. In my head, I was like, you work your way up from a private. I knew nothing about the military in general. You work your way up from a private, and then eventually you reach the rank of, lieutenant or captain down the road. But I almost didn't believe him. And then I did some research on the internet, and applied for a Navy scholarship and an Army scholarship, and then ended up going to Penn State on an Army ROTC scholarship. They were certainly trying to get more officers in the pipeline. This was back in 07. So 07 is when I signed, the 4-year ROTC scholarship contract.
So you would be a year group 2000. If you were still in today, you'd be a year group 2010 or 2011 officer.
2011.
Yeah, we'd be on the same kind of glide path.
Yeah, and I'm still serving in the reserves. So I do the weekend warrior thing. It's quite different from being active duty, but it's still good to serve. A lot of the folks that are in my unit were former active duty folks, so it's definitely good to stay connected.
Yeah, I think the reserves too, they have a pretty well-rounded depth chart. I think everyone within that, at least that I've seen, because I was in the National Guard before I went active duty, and they had a pretty well-rounded depth chart. But I remember when my unit that I was in the National Guard deployed to Soldier City, they did a phenomenal job with what their basic engineering job was, because they did it for full time as a civilian. And I remember active duty, 82nd and all those guys that were with them in Soldier City, Iraq, were just praising that National Guard unit of how quickly they could build T-walls and do all these types of fortification compared to other people. But that's because they live and breathe that. That's their normal W-2 job every day.
Yeah, I believe it. And I had the same experience. The cop that you used to live on that handed off to me was made smaller to hand off to the Afghans by a National Guard unit. And they were very professional, and they moved a lot quicker than a lot of the active duty components, a lot of their counterparts that were active duty, just because a lot of them did have civilian experience in the general contracting world as their civilian job. So they operated pretty efficiently.
Yeah. So you joined the military, you joined the Army, you kind of niched down. What chose you to go down the path of infantry? Was that a branch choice that you chose to go down, or was that kind of were you unlucky in that path?
No, that was certainly a desire of mine. I'd say, leading up to it, I think the idea of going infantry was a little bit daunting for me. Especially maybe my freshman or sophomore year as a cadet in ROTC. And then I think I built some confidence when we went out to LDAC, which is, the training that you do between your junior and senior year. And you kind of do an array of sessions and physical tests to determine how you rank up against the other cadets in the nation. And I think that built my confidence up to where, when I got back to school my senior year, infantry seemed like it'd be I saw it as more of a challenge. I think I had the baseline physical readiness to do it. I did pretty well at LDAC. My grades were okay. So what I did is I did choose finance as a control branch, but then you can volunteer for a branch detail to infantry. And so I checked that block, basically assuring that you would get infantry, because the finance branch is very heavy on the higher ranks, and they don't have a strong need for that many lieutenants. I think when I was graduating, they only commissioned maybe 40 or 50 lieutenants into finance every year.
Oh, wow.
So the need was definitely at the higher ranks, captain, major, and above. But I was either going to do aviation or infantry. I've been fortunate in my career to be exposed to both of those. I did aviation in the civilian world when I got out, but infantry was definitely my top pick. That's what I wanted to do as a lieutenant. So
it's funny how the winds of time kind of change. Is that I'm now working in PO aviation as an acquisition officer, and they're literally in charge of maintaining the aviation fleet and then getting out new equipment. So the same way I've always ever wanted to go into the infantry. And to me, I had that burning desire in college. And what sold me was when I was in high school, seeing those recruiting videos of soldiers kind of going through basic training and these guys out in camouflage out in the field. I was like, that's what I
Yep.
want to do. Like, someone's going to pay me to go to the range and
Yep.
shoot targets all day and to lead. And they had like 100%. I was all in. I had that, I call like that burning desire. And LDAC for everyone, if you're listening, Leaders Development Sessions course, and how that kind of works for Army officers is we go to college if you're ROTC, a Reserve Officer Training course, and you are put on an OML, Order of Merit list, with all the peers nationally, and you're racked and stacked, and they choose the top of those peers to go into more in-demand skill sets, and infantry is one of those in-demand skill sets. So I want to make sure that that's not missed by the listeners, is that, Jack was one of the top officers in his year group and got the branch choice that he wanted. I remember, dude, I got a criminal justice degree just so I could get good grades, so I could get infantry. I didn't even care what my degree was, because now I have
Yeah,
a
sure.
master's in engineering. I was like, I'm going to get infantry. I was 100% in.
Yeah, your GPA is, at least it was back then, it was heavily weighted. I think it was
Yeah.
40% of your sessions was, basically out of a 4.0, that would be 40 points out of 100 towards your sessions. And your grades were certainly heavily weighted in that accession process. So that makes sense. But I wouldn't have it any other way. I mean, going infantry is certainly a really unique experience in the Army. I'd say it's unique aside from the other branches.
Mm-hmm.
You certainly interact with the other branches, and you have to kind of have a unique mix of leadership skills, physicality, and be able to think on the fly that I wouldn't say a lot of other branches really require.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think the level of physicality comes down to the point of that to do your basic job, you have to be physically fit to be able to do that in a stressful scenario. So like where normal soldiers every day go and do an obstacle course of where they're jumping over an 8-foot wall with body armor, that may be like one of their pillars of success. But in my eyes, as an infantryman, that is something that you have to do, because I've seen soldiers in combat suffer heat injuries, go down for non-life-threatening issues that affected a platoon or a company operation because they weren't physically fit. So that is super true. Is there's a level of physicality that comes with being an infantryman, and I think what they call it, the infantryman's arrogance of when we walk around barrel-chested freedom fighters. We have our blue cord, and everyone knows when you walk into the room.
It's the real deal. Yeah, I would say, certainly there was a bit of pride in our infantry battalion that, there were all these other branches and all these other job functions are there to support us. And that's pretty cool. I mean, when you're the highest ranking officer on the ground, you're the tactical commander on ground, the ISR assets and, the CCA assets, the CAS assets are all looking to you for guidance on what you need, like how to best support you. And that's pretty cool, I think.
So kind of, you chose infantry. You had that passion to do the job. You get to Fort Benning, and I know this path pretty familiar. What challenges did you encounter at Fort Benning before you got to your unit?
Yeah, sure. So I'd say when I showed up and signed into Fort Benning on my first day of IBOLC, I don't know if it's still called that, but basically the infantry basic officer leaders course down at Fort Benning, I was intimidated. I was in a class with a lot of West Point cadets that were, fresh off their 60-day leave. A lot of them were, top of their class at West Point, had been college level athletes, gotten good grades. They all had technical backgrounds and had lived and breathed infantry tactics while they were at West Point. So I would say, yeah, I definitely came into my IBOLC platoon a little intimidated. I'd say that, that didn't last too long. I'd say once we got to the field training exercises, a lot of that physicality that you saw when you were in garrison, whether it be like a timed 5-mile run or a rucksack in a controlled setting, that became less important when you were all of a sudden awake for 22 hours straight, having to move around Fort Benning with a rucksack for 15 miles. A lot of people don't respond well to that kind of stress. And I found myself able to continue to keep going, and able to lead patrols under highly stressful situations like that. So I'd say my confidence built up during IBOLC. The beginning, I was fairly intimidated, and there was definitely times where I questioned my decision to go infantry, especially the first 4 weeks. Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
So that's a really good point to kind of decipher, is because I was the same way when I showed up to IBOLC and I was standing out at the field. I can't remember the name of it now, but I guarantee you it's the exact same one.
Oh yeah.
And looking around and seeing all of these previous NCOs that did green to gold, and they have all these badges, and some of them have Ranger tabs already, and some of them have SF Special Forces tabs. And I'm already comparing myself, mentally to them. It's like, man, these guys are just going to absolutely, annihilate me in this course. But when we started field problems, that's where I started to separate, at least myself, and start building that confidence, because I had a level of work ethic. And I think that was the separating factor with me, is that you may be more talented than me, you may be smarter than me, but you're not going to outwork me. I don't care who you are. You're not going to outwork me. I may run, a 14-minute 2-mile, and you may run 11-minute 2-mile. But at the end of the day, we're still going to be the same when the bullets are flying. You may be able to get to your fighting position just a second faster than me.
Sure. Yeah.
So, all right. So you walk through IBOLC, you do the Ranger School thing, airborne, I'm assuming, all those, and then you get to your first unit. How long were you at your unit before you deployed?
Let me think on this. I arrived at 136 Infantry of Fort Bliss in, I want to say late March, early April. I want to say early April 2012.
Okay.
And then I deployed beginning of December 2012.
Yeah.
Yeah. So not too much time. A lot of that time was spent out in the field, out of the various, ranges around Fort Bliss and the McGregor Range Complex in New Mexico. And then a month was also spent at the National Training Center at Fort Irwin. So yeah, yeah. In August too, which was great. Yeah. That was great training to go to the AO that we went to.
Yep.
It really tested kind of the limits of what you can withstand with regards to the heat index at Fort Irwin in August was pretty brutal, but it definitely prepared us well. But yeah, I probably didn't spend much time at Fort Bliss. And then found out I was going to deploy early to go on the Advon group to go meet up with you guys in December. So
I think there's a lot of powerful lessons to kind of pull from that time as a platoon leader. When you first show up to your unit, I unfortunately had to take over my platoon in combat, and I did it after a very unfortunate chain of events. So the platoon that I had deployed with, and I know you probably know this because you ripped out with me literally in Afghanistan. Yep. They deployed with 44 soldiers, but when I took over, there were 28. The original platoon sergeant was gone. The weapons squad leader, the most two senior non-commissioned officers in your formation were gone. And I had the blessing to have amazing NCOs. And it's crazy is that one of my squad leaders from IBOLC, Sergeant Kabyab, was literally a squad leader for me when I showed up to my unit. So he already knew when I was in Afghanistan, already knew all my isms. Like, all right, Josh, I know the X, Y, and Z. So he was instrumental in my ability to come in and do it in such a humble manner, because it was very humbling for me to take over that platoon in Afghanistan. My first interaction with them was at Sergeant Rodriguez's memorial, team leader who just passed away in a complex ambush. And I'm looking around, and I said this before, but I had an agenda at that point. Like my agenda was, hey, what can I do to become a Ranger platoon leader, to go do all these different things? So I was trying to seek all these different titles. I was trying to get awards, and I always kind of go back to that moment in We Were Soldiers where you see that lieutenant climbing the hill and the sergeant major, and that Lieutenant Colonel Moore is standing there like that lieutenant wants to win medals.
Yep.
But right before that moment, that was my mentality, is that I wanted to win medals. And then I was in that memorial service, and it just humbled me to my core. And I've carried that for the rest of my career. So when you came in, being in a garrison mindset, how did you start to develop that mentality that you're going to a combat zone? And what challenges did you face when you first took over?
Yeah, I was definitely fortunate that our battalion had really good leadership, and it had deliberately pulled in seasoned non-commissioned officers from various
Yeah.
light units, various mechanized units, striker units, and had kind of pulled them into this new, striker brigade combat team that was relatively new to the Army. So the experience was there, and I'd say, we had a really strong group of core NCOs. We had a really, really good group of young soldiers that, were probably a year or two out of AIT. And so really my role was just to make sure that we all meshed together in
Mm.
all of the simulated combat operations we did at Fort Bliss, squad sticks all the way up to platoon and company level operations, battalion level operations, just make sure that we all meshed together. And that me and my platoon sergeant identified, the strengths in our squad leaders and really leveraged those strengths to better the whole platoon. We had one NCO that knew every nook and cranny of the striker and all the weapon systems associated with it. We
Yeah.
had one guy who knew nothing about those, but he was, 101st Airborne guy with 3 or 4 combat deployments to Iraq, Afghanistan. So he knew the ground level tactics. He could help me plan the dismounted patrols. So you really have to play to their strengths and then utilize their strengths to elevate the entire organization. In this instance, a platoon, a rifle
Mm.
platoon. That's really key. And I think another thing that's key is anything that we did, whether or not, whether we did a PT plan for the month, a physical training plan for the month, or planning like a squad or platoon level operation, get the leaders below you involved in the planning process.
Mm.
They're more apt to give you feedback on what works and what doesn't work. And they're more invested in the plan itself. They know the plan better. They help create it, help, write the plan. It's really good to engage, the people that work under you and make sure that they have skin in the game. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, dude, that's awesome. When you go to a combat zone, I think it's part of just building any organization. Two of the most important things to build is relationships,
Mm-hmm.
and relationships takes time. Going through crucible events, or just being with an organization long enough. If you share the same core values, I truly believe that you're going to build authentic relationships, and relationships, in my mind, come in two forms. So trust, which is earned through being a competent leader, being professional, have a strong reputation, and being rad. I always throw that out there of being routine, accountable, and disciplined, doing what you say you're going to do. And then redundancy. And that's a key thing. I think that you kind of painted that picture there, is that everyone in your platoon had a clear task and purpose. But what happens when someone in your platoon goes down, right? Having another person who can step up in there, and that's absolutely key in military or in the civilian realm. You can't just have one individual who is the belly button for whatever it is. So I think a perfect example of the world I'm in right now, acquisitions. I have a individual who is our TM writer, and he writes all the TMs for SUAS. And
Yep.
he had a major issue, had to have brain surgery essentially, and he was out. So that stops all TM development for multiple products within small soldier UAS. And it's an issue of that. As a leader, you have to be able to look in your formation. And you just beautifully captured one of the rules of leadership that I've kind of journaled on, and is the rule of strengths. Look in your formation and then understand what unique strengths do your leaders bring to the table, especially when you can't hire them, that you
Yeah.
fall in and inherit them. What strengths do they have to the table? And then how can you leverage those strengths to achieve a mission and then have a shared vision kind of driving forward? And understanding those strengths are also your ability to mitigate risk, because when you can control people's strengths and you understand how to employ them, then you're naturally starting to eat away at the weakness within your formation. So if you do have a weakness, well, we'll just use an example. Sergeant First Class Kearns was a phenomenal NCO, a military bearing like no other, but he was very black and white. The best non-commissioned officer, hands down, I think I've ever worked for. And here was me, this bubbly new lieutenant coming in. Hey guys, I want to be your friend. And he would pull me aside and be like, hey, sir, like, I understand that you're very people focused, you're very relationship based, and you're trying to build relationships, but they don't need that kind of leader right now.
Yeah, it's true.
And yeah, I wanted to make sure I go through that. And then you said another thing too that I think is great, and mission command. So in the military, there's a concept of mission command. I think it's ADP 6-0. And the difference of a perfect example right now is Russia and Ukraine. Why is Russia so bad at unified land operations? In my mind, this is just my opinion. They cannot delegate authority down to the lowest level. Decisions at the tactical level have to go all the way up to some dude who's sipping, whatever drink he's sipping at some cop that's completely separated from the tactical decisions. But in the U.S. military, how we operate, and it's opposite of what most people think, is that the ground commander, oftentimes that young lieutenant, sometimes an E6 or even an E5, a non-commissioned officer, makes those tactical decisions, life and death situations at the time, because we empower him to do that. We empower her to do that. And when you do that, you're creating a level of commitment from that individual, and most importantly, accountability. So I think there's two aspects. Is now you got me all fired up. Is there's responsibilities. Is when you take over a job, we have the responsibility to do that. Like as a lieutenant, when you took over that job, you had a clear set of responsibilities that you had to follow. But you also have accountability, which is after the fact. When something happens and you mess up, and it will, it's just inevitable. Failure is inevitable. It's a part of life. You have to move from the realm of responsibilities into accountability. And you can only do that if you create commitment. So you dropped so many nuggets of wisdom. I wanted to go back and really dig on those.
Yeah, certainly. And it's interesting looking back on that, I almost feel, severely unqualified for that platoon leader job, fresh out of IBOLC. But, I was fortunate to have a good platoon. But at 22, 23 years old, that's a pretty heavy burden. That type of leadership role is definitely weighed pretty heavily on me. I mean, I was fortunate to have the luxury of a full train up cycle leading up to a deployment, but I can't imagine in your position taking over a platoon in combat. I mean, I saw that happen several times when I was there, and I can't even imagine. I certainly wouldn't be equipped to do that. So
I remember it was humbling, man. The platoon was actually out at I can't remember the name now, but out at an outpost right on the Arghandab Valley, right between Panjwai. And I think at the time that was right outside of Maywan, if you remember that cop that was Dagobad, Cop Dagobad.
Yeah, I remember it well. Yeah.
Yep. That was the very first cop. And they were out at an outpost of where they had to do continuous rotations as a platoon. And I come and I meet Captain Wolfschleigel at the time, my company commander, and First Sergeant Powers, Lieutenant Mackey, the XO. And they're like, hey, your platoon's out. They're not going to be back for 24 hours. This is where they're staying. Get ready. And I had 24 hours to myself of thinking how my first interaction with my platoon was going to go. And dude, that was the most nerve-wracking time in my life, because I knew it's a humbling when you take that over. So walk me through when we first met. So you started to deploy, you were with the Advon or you were with Torch. And did you know what AO you were going to?
Yeah, I'd say we were fortunate that we had a battalion commander that did an extensive research on the area of operations that we were going to,
That's
and
awesome.
we had a lot of insight as to what was going on, what you guys were dealing with. I think he
Yeah.
had actually traveled over to Afghanistan at least once, maybe multiple times,
Mm,
and so we were fortunate that he briefed us personally on what was going on, what to expect, and really made a concerted effort to, book back-to-back small arms ranges,
mm,
situational training lanes that involved IEDs, simulated IEDs, and so we knew what we were getting into. I'd say for a lot of us, even folks that had deployed previously, it still ended up being a very kinetic deployment for us. But I think we kind of knew, at least from a PowerPoint slide, what to expect. And yeah, I remember it very, 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 very well. Our XO was supposed to be part of that Advon team, so we could go over there and get eyes on all the equipment that you all were handing off to us. He was not able to go last minute, so I found
mm.
out maybe 2 weeks before Christmas that, hey, you're going to Afghanistan, in 10 days instead of a month.
Oh, wow.
And I, it ended up being fortuitous to me because I had the luxury of hanging out with you and your counterparts. And I'll never forget this. We flew out from Fort Bliss, Texas, a chartered commercial airliner, stopped for gas in Anchorage, Alaska, middle of December, no sunlight. And then we made the journey down to Kyrgyzstan.
Mm,
Um, did a couple days of training there and waiting for the next plane. Took a C-17 to Kandahar Airfield, and then I got on a Black Hawk probably around, maybe 7 or 8 p.m. right around sunset, and the Black Hawk took me from Kandahar Airfield to you guys out there at Cop Pankale was the name of the
yeah.
cop. So I think you and your first sergeant were probably two of the first people I met when we landed. It was pitch dark. And so once we got out of the rotor wash, you guys were nice enough to greet us at the HLZ and walk us into the company level talk. And then from there, I mean, it was pretty much drinking from a fire hose from you, just kind of, me and the other Advon personnel just trying to figure out, what you guys were up to, and then you imparting as much wisdom as you could on the AO to me and a few of my soldiers that were there with me. So
How I'm so curious, and this is the beauty about podcasting, man, is that I can literally have, a growth conversation of how I could be a better leader 10 years ago. And I totally remember that as you were walking through the story. I remember the
yep.
HLZ right out there, and I remember you coming off and taking you in the talk. And I'll be honest with you, I was really nervous about this rip because about a month beforehand, I was in charge of my own AO. So that was one issue that I had when I was in Afghanistan, is that we moved constantly,
Sure.
and I was over my own battle space in Nalgam, and I only had maybe a month to learn the AO well enough to where I could hand it off to someone who had to have the expectation of hitting the ground running and getting results.
Yep.
And I was under myself a level of pressure of like, okay, I have to try and absorb this as quickly as possible. So, like from your end, what areas could I have improved on?
That's a great question. I'd say from my perspective, maybe, I mean, in the limited time you spent in that battle space, maybe, identifying some of the local Afghan leaders that were influential in the area. And then I'd say the only other thing that would have been beneficial, is maybe spending more time with our Afghan counterparts that lived on the COP with us. I
Hmm.
felt like that was an area where, we did build better relationships with them and were able to communicate better with them as the deployment went on. But those are really the only two areas that stick out to me. I'd say overall, you really set me up for success. I mean, you walked me through all the available ISR platforms, all the geography of, what's going on in the area. I think, you and some of the other lieutenants did a really fantastic job at kind of imparting all of your knowledge from, the last, how long were you guys over there? 9 months,
Yeah,
a year,
9 to
nine,
10
10 months.
months. Yep.
Yeah, I think you guys did a really good job just imparting as much knowledge and as much tactics that worked in that AO as you could. And I definitely felt a lot better prepared than the lieutenants that came probably 3 or 4 weeks after I did with the main body, the rest of my company. I felt much better prepared just having, a few weeks with you guys, and spending a lot of one-on-one time with you and the other lieutenants there and a lot of your squad leaders. I think that was invaluable to me. So
I'll never forget the mission that we were supposed to go do. If you remember this, it was supposed to be one of our,
yeah,
and we get halfway out into this desert, and it's
yeah,
right below a sand dune. And I can't remember why, but for whatever reason, we weren't allowed to go into this village.
yep,
And your comments were spot on. Is that, hey, better engagement with individuals of who kind of ran that, like the tribal leaders. And that was the intention of that. And I can't for the life of me remember why I was told not to go into that village, and all we did was donuts. Like we
yeah,
did like a patrol in the sand, and it
yeah.
was like a loop around of like 400 meters. We broke, if you remember the Matador. I don't know if you
Oh, I
remember that
remember
or not.
that. Yeah,
Yeah.
the remote control Bobcat configuration. Yeah, that was an interesting piece of equipment. So
I gotta explain that to everyone because I don't even know if they make this anymore.
I don't
So
know. Yeah, that's an interesting concept. I mean, it was definitely a cool piece of machinery to have on site. Yeah, it was helpful. So
if they could have put a 50 cal or something on there, I would have loved that thing, man.
I think they're working on that kind of stuff now. So I'm excited for what the future holds. So
Yeah. So after we left, how did your deployment go? What were some of the major challenges that you had to work through as a lieutenant?
yeah, I would say the deployment went really well overall for my platoon. We were fortunate that we always had pretty well thought out routes in most of the missions that whether we drove or walked out of the cop dismounted or did an air assault. We did a lot of really tight knit planning between me, the squad leaders, and my platoon sergeant. So that was really helpful. I think we had a really good connection with the guy that operated our ISR assets on the COP. So we knew, within our platoon battle space, where the potential threats were, where the IEDs were, where were potential places that the enemy would set up small arms, typically a couple PKMs. I think we had a very, very good understanding and we're well connected with not only the civilians that operated the ISR assets, but we had a couple of intel guys that operated our counterintelligence cell on the COP. And I think that communication flowed very well with myself and my squad leaders, and that benefited us a lot. Our company did suffer quite a bit of casualties and mostly IED related, so that was incredibly challenging for our company level leadership
Yeah.
and for the guys that had built strong relationships and deep bonds with some of the guys that did not finish the deployment with us. So
Team, I want to take a quick break from this episode and personally invite you to join our tribe. Are you looking for a community of leaders? If you are a leader at any level, join our Purposeful Accountable Leaders private Facebook or LinkedIn group. We would love to have you on the team. My mission is to create a community that allows leaders to ask questions, celebrate wins, and share lessons learned. All I ask is that you follow the B rule. Be respectful, be humble, be present, and add value to the community. You can find the link in the show notes to either join the Facebook or LinkedIn group or simply just search Purposeful Accountable Leaders. Back to the podcast. I remember hearing that news of when some of those issues happened, and I couldn't help but think of, man, I failed those guys. And that was my first thought of when I heard that we were at JBLM. I think Sergeant First Class Kearns pulled me in. We were in our platoon, kind of like AO in our company AO,
yeah,
and they were walking through some of those issues that happened. Our battalion commander pulled us in, and they told us the company that happened to and where it happened. And I'm just sitting there and like stewing at myself, thinking, man, I failed those guys. Um,
Yeah, I think of it the opposite way. I think if I hadn't had that 2 or 3 weeks with you guys, I think it would have been a way worse situation. I don't think we would have fully leveraged all the assets that we had available on that COP
Yeah.
To the fullest capabilities. So I think of it the exact opposite. We were fortunate that my platoon didn't really suffer any major casualties. All of us came home in one piece. But I'd say that certainly I attribute a lot of that to you and a lot of the stuff that you shared with us. And I can say almost without a shadow of a doubt that I was much better equipped spending that time with you and your guys. So
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that, brother.
yeah, I mean it.
So kind of working through your leadership journey, you get back and your branch detail. So you knew you're probably leaving the infantry. What were kind of running through your thoughts? Because I remember when I got back from Afghanistan, I was like, "Hey, infantry or bust." It's
Yeah,
that's all I know.
That's how I felt too. Yeah,
yeah,
that's how I felt. Yeah, I had no desire to go to finance, and I discovered that pretty quickly when I got back. I spent 19 months as a platoon leader. And 9 of those, well, I guess almost 10 of those months were in combat. At a company level COP or on patrol. So, I'd say as a 19-month on the job PL, you feel like you finally got the job figured out, and that's when they decide to move you to a XO position. But
Yep.
you finally feel like you're an okay, like a decent platoon leader at best. And they moved me to one of our sister companies. And yeah, I think at that point, just the deep connections that I built within the infantry and just the type of people that volunteer for that role, it was really going to be too difficult for me to transition to a finance job. I mean, even though it was probably is better suited to the civilian world, and it probably would be a fairly cush office job. That's not really what I wanted. And so, it was a tough decision. I mean, I was coming up on the end of my ROTC commitment. I owed the Army 4 years of active duty service. And my wife and I had to really have a lot of tough discussions about whether or not we wanted to continue down the military path or not.
Yeah.
So
Ultimately, what drove you to transition from active duty to reserve duty?
it was a couple of different reasons. I think my initial plan in college was to serve 4 years active duty and then transition into the business world, move into a corporate role. And so that is the plan that I defaulted back to. But it wasn't as easy of a choice as I thought. I thought that would, be clear cut. I'd do 4 years active duty and then transition into a corporate job somewhere. And it wasn't that easy. I did consider, doing a VTIP application to stay infantry, which was approved. So I had a couple options. I could continue down, the infantry route and go to captain's career course, go back to Fort Benning. I could transition into a finance role, or I could, look for other gainful employment outside the military. And I think the main considerations were we were going to start a family. So we found out that we were pregnant, and, we were expecting our first daughter. And I think, out of the 4 years I was active duty, I probably was, around maybe, 14 to 18 months of those 4 years that I was actually present and there around my wife. And that weighed heavily on my heart on whether or not I wanted to, to be a father that spent a lot of time away, extended time away. And that's just kind of the reality of being an infantry officer. If you've continued down that path, you're going to do a lot of training in the field. You're going to do deployments. Maybe not, the op tempo is a lot different now, but that's kind of the reality of your job. So that was probably the primary reason that I decided to transition back into the civilian world.
So I see that the exact same way. Kind of in terms of leadership intelligence of like, emotional intelligence, understanding the room of how to be successful, communicate with people, picking up on cues, soft cues. But I see leadership intelligence as the same way of your ability to exceed is based on your direct involvement. So I break it down to tactical, operational, and strategical. Tactical level leadership intelligence means I have to go out and take a PT test. My PT results are directly correlated to how successful I am.
Yep.
And then as you continue to progress on your rank in operational leadership, I am now managing a platoon. I'm now managing a company. I'm still organizing, I'm still directing, I'm still providing a task, purpose, and direction. But at the end of the day, it's not me who has to produce it. It is those individual soldiers. And then you kind of keep going up to like a strategic level leadership. And I see that as like a general kind of level. But what you just said is absolutely true. The longer you stay in, the more rank you gain. The
Yep.
more rank you gain, there is a duality to that. Is yes, if you're chasing a rank or a title, you're going to have more position, you're going to have more authority, you're going to have more pay. But are you ready with what comes with that? Because what comes with that is more time away from your family. I remember when I was a company commander, and this is one thing that still I'll never forgive the Army for this. But it's nothing that could have prevented. But my wife went into preterm labor, and I'm pretty sure that's why my son now has asthma. In my mind, is we were getting ready to deploy to Syria. Me being me, I totally, kind of forgot to tell my wife this
Yeah.
was happening. But to my defense, it was that same day. So we found out we were going, but I didn't want to worry her because she was pregnant with our second child.
Yeah.
And she was like,
Understandable.
"Hey, you're going to Syria, you're not going to Syria. You're going to Syria, you're not going to Syria." So I was like, we're not going. And then we're at a battalion ball, which was a day in itself. I could probably do a whole podcast on all the epic failures that went down there. But my battalion commander walks up to me and my wife, and he's like, "Did you tell her the great news?" And I was like, "Don't you do it, you son of a biscuit! Don't do it." He's like, "Yeah, he's deploying to Syria," and it's like,
Oh my gosh.
she's like, "You
Yeah.
didn't tell me that." And then like 2 days later, my wife goes in preterm labor because of the amount of stress that goes with it, and
Yeah.
that caused my son. I'm convinced caused my son to have asthma, and I started seeing that trend. Is that I love the Army. I love soldiers. Then that's my passion. My passion is adding value to service members. That's the whole reason that I'm doing all this. But at the cost of what my family. That's my legacy of how my daughter and how my son turn out. That's the truest test of leadership, in my opinion, is
It is.
how our kids turn out.
Absolutely is.
Kind of walk me through as you transition. What was the most important lesson that you learned from the military up to that point? Because you probably have so many great wisdom points, especially just from Afghanistan. What was the one thing?
Yeah. I'd say, what really stuck out to me is just the level of commitment that you develop, within a platoon that's in a combat environment. Just
Mm,
the level of trust and commitment that you can develop with another human being in that environment is unfathomable to most people that haven't experienced it. And it's like, the guys that, were in the striker behind me, or were dismounted in front of me, behind me, and, ensuring my own safety. You have absolute trust in those guys, and you spend so much time with each other. You spend just 24/7 within an arm's length of these individuals, and you get to know them on such a deep level that's hard to replace. And that's something that a lot of veterans struggle with when they transition,
yeah.
is they're so used to being surrounded by people that they just have absolute trust in. And that's not very common outside the military, to my knowledge. So a lot of veterans struggle with that, myself included. You have this support network, when you go to the office or you go to the field. You're with these guys 24/7, and you develop these deep bonds, and then suddenly you don't have those anymore when you transition out. And I think a lot of people in general struggle with that, myself included. But that was the biggest lesson I learned from being in the military, is just how far another human being is willing to go, to protect your life and the lives of the people around you, is incredible. I mean, it's really, really incredible.
Yeah, I love how you said that too. Absolute trust. And I kind of see myself walking through a lot of those same situations of how we were almost like the same organism in a way.
Yep.
When you're going
Hmm.
on a patrol, they just naturally knew to be distant from you to a certain distance based on the level of threat. When you dismounted, people just naturally knew where to go assume security. It was like a beautiful orchestra. One of my, friends that I work with now, he'll love this, is Megadeth, a Symphony of Destruction. So like
Yeah.
it's just beautifully happens all by itself, just naturally. That's a great takeaway. So
Hmm.
transitioning into corporate America, you get ready to take over. I don't know if this was your first role or not, but the business development director role.
Yeah, that's my current role. And what a lot of folks don't realize when you transition out of the military and you want to get into some sort of sales or business development function, or even a project management function, a lot of times, especially if you get out as a lieutenant or a junior officer, you may be an individual contributor again. You might be
Mm,
your peers might be new college grads, or folks with a couple of years of actual work experience under their belt, which gives you a different perspective um, from where you've been. I mean, it's a very different scenario leading a group of infantrymen in combat, and then all of a sudden, you're a field salesperson, you're an individual contributor.
yeah.
You really have to manage. You have to manage your own schedule. Your boss is likely to be, much more hands off. Um, and so that's a really interesting transition to go to. It's just a much different job function and a much different lifestyle than what I was used to. But I was fortunate. I think I had a few veterans on my sales team that were just unbelievably supportive of my efforts, because I definitely struggled my first year in sales. I had a lot of doubts about my self confidence, or maybe I chose the wrong job function, or put a lot of pressure on myself. You got a new family to support, a new infant daughter to support, and I go from being pretty well regarded in an infantry battalion to now I have to make a name for myself in a whole new industry, in a whole new organization, which is really challenging and humbling. But like I said, I had a few directors. Some of them were former veterans. Some of them are veterans that really came around me and lifted me up. And yeah, I'll definitely be forever grateful for those people. They helped make the transition a lot easier.
Yeah, that's another area. One of the rules that I kind of journaled on is the rule of the tribe. So we always
Hmm.
talk like our network is our net worth. I kind of flip it on its axis, is that I want to surround myself with failures, because a failure means that they're willing to take risks, do things that are challenging, and then ultimately succeed. Because
Yep.
that's all it is, right? Like when you, and it's a theme that I noticed when you and I first joined the military, and then now where you're in the civilian realm, when you were out there on the parade field and you saw all those West Point cadets, you kind of had that level of insecurity or imposter syndrome. And it's
Sure.
the same way as when you transitioned out, is like, well, maybe I don't have this fancy degree, or I don't have any business experience, but what you did have was real life experience and the ability to build authentic connections and trust, and that level of absolute trust that you were talking about. And when you surround yourself with someone who, I call them like accountability trees, someone who's deeply rooted, firmly rooted, and unmovable, does not hear excuses, but provides shade when times get tough. That is how you make it through those challenging times. Is you have to surround yourself with great mentors. That's awesome. And another thing that I got from that, of what you're talking about, is kind of being okay with reinventing yourself. So how I talked about the levels of leadership intelligence, you were, operational, and then you went back to tactical. And well, that's because in my eyes, I see leadership in six different levels, but it's a repeatable cycle. So we
Yeah.
have self leadership. That's the first level. We have to learn to lead ourselves. And then you have situational leadership, where you get a position. Then you have strengthening relationships, where you have to build authentic relationships. And then you have succeeding together, phase 4, of where you actually start getting and building relationships. And now you're getting results. Phase 5 is where you start shaping other leaders in the organization. But oops, You get plucked out of that organization, you get put in another organization. It's literally a scientific method to be successful at what I like to call like a purposeful, accountable leader. And it all centers around like the definition of leadership for me is to inspire. But how
Yeah.
do you inspire? I think there's quantifiable metrics there as a proficiency. You have to understand the tools that you have, just like your arms room, right? So how am I going to leverage these tools and how am I going to maneuver them? I don't necessarily have to use them, but I know how to make sure that they're successful in the battlefield. Your reputation, which you already had, and then getting results. If you can be proficient, have a strong reputation, and produce output, kind of pro, in my mind, that's to inspire, and that's awesome. I wanted to unpack that.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the ability to inspire other folks to perform at their highest potential is that's one of the things that brings me the most joy. I mean, seeing that in the military, if you have a young specialist or a young sergeant and seeing them get promoted and be successful. And then a lot of the guys that, were saw gunners or, new team leaders in my platoon are now, they're now sergeant first classes and getting ready to make, potentially make first sergeant, and they're leading platoons on their own now, and they're being very, very successful. So that's really what brings me a lot of joy, is just knowing that you are a small part of their success along the way. I think that's really, there's nothing like it, man. That's the best part of being a leader.
So I'd love to kind of think, long term, where you're currently at on your leadership journey. Where do you want to go in the next, 5 to 10 years? And what is that passion or burning desire that's helping you get there?
Yeah. I mean, where I'd like to be in the next few years is to lead a business development team that, serves the military. That's similar to what my current role is, and really to bring up, young business development and salespeople that, and equip them with the skill set that is going to enable them to be a leader, within our organization in the future. I think that's really, what I like to do. I mean, identifying a person's strengths, figuring out what role, what the next role would be for them that's going to develop them, stretch their skill set, and maybe equip them with a new skill set and help them along the way. That's really that's the best part of my job is, you can remove roadblocks for your people that work under you, and then equip them to be successful and to be leaders within the organization themselves, and boost their confidence along the way, and also foster a workplace that people enjoy coming to. And I think that's often overlooked, is that one thing I ask my guys all the time, I ask them, are you having fun? And I don't think a lot of people think about that. When you're working a typical office job, or if you're, working for a defense contractor, are you having fun? And if the folks are not enjoying coming into work, it's unlikely they're going to perform at the highest level. And I've seen it both ways. And a lot of folks that have been in the military can probably relate to, when they have a change of command and you have a new commander come in that just really instills kind of a different attitude within the organization. And a lot of times that attitude is a positive one. They have a positive outlook. They're friendly with, the personnel under them, and they're actually eager to get to know the leaders that are under them. And I think that's really, that's something that's often overlooked.
That's awesome. And I think that's kind of like a superpower of mine, of how I was always so successful in the infantry compared to my peers, is people saw, hey, platoon leader, you're there for a year. Company commander, you're there for a year if you get a second command, or you're there for 18 months and you move on.
Yeah.
I savored every single moment that I was there. And I truly tried to create a deep bond and connection with the soldiers that I had. Like, I don't just want to know what your name is.
Yep.
I want to know what your hobbies are. I want to know what gets Jacob out of bed every single day. But I think too often people are focused on profits or just results, and they forget about the people. But if you want top performance, you have to create a top climate. You have to. There's no give and take. You can't just always demand, and there's a time for that in leadership. Not to be
Yeah.
naive, we have to be hard on people when the operational environment demands it.
Hmm.
But if you want to create a positive climate, a problem-solving organization, you have to learn to accept the whole person. I think that's what is missing with most leaders is they view people as the work employee. Like Jack, if you and I were working together, I wouldn't just see you as my director. I would see you as a father. I would see you as a husband. I would see you as a leader. And I would understand when life got a vote that there's probably something going on in either the area of work, family, or self. That's kind of the triad that I've broken it down to. Something there is out of whack. And if we're going to get you back to the top performance that we need you to because it helps soldiers, then we got to figure out how to do that together as a team.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So,
I couldn't agree more. Yeah. You have to see the person as a human being, and, human beings, they go through struggles with their personal life, their children, with their spouse that ultimately are going to affect their work performance, whether they admit it or not. So yeah, seeing the person as a human being as a whole is really, really important.
so I think the last question before we get to our final show segment is, how is your leadership philosophy? I call it a house of leadership adopted after J.R. Flatter. How's it changed over the years? So you had a leadership philosophy, maybe you didn't when you took over a platoon, and then it's shaped or it's molded, it's changed, it's matured over your course of your military career, and now you're in this civilian realm. How has your leadership philosophy changed?
Yeah, I'd say I'm a much better listener.
Mm,
Um, and when I say listen, like really listen to what someone's telling you, and then take note, either take a mental note or actually write it down, and remember that that's what this person just told me is significant to them, and it's a part of who they are. Um, I was probably a little bit abrasive in my communication as a platoon leader at times.
I think we all were.
Yeah, when you really didn't need to be.
Yeah.
And so you figure out a style of communications that works and that is most effective. And I'd say in the business world, that oftentimes means you're leading people outside of your functional team. You're working with with cross functional teams, whether it be a engineering department, an R&D team, a
Yeah.
manufacturing team, and you have to figure out what drives them, and how to get them to be aligned with your goals and kind of like
Mm.
your bigger vision of what you want to accomplish, what's best for the customer, and what's best for the organization as a whole. I'd say I'm much better at giving honest feedback without being as abrasive anymore. That's one thing that I'm continuing to improve. That's one thing I need to continue to improve too, is how to give honest feedback that's going to be received in a way that's constructive, and not seen as a negative way. That's a very, very difficult thing to do. So
That is one of the tricks of life, is how to deliver criticism in a way where it's not a personal attack.
mhm.
It is a way to improve. And then having that individual see it as that, hey, there's a better way to do it. I think we should try it this way, but doing it to where you don't belittle them, because the moment you do that, their wall just instantly goes up. And maybe they
Absolutely.
shared something with you, but they're not going to do it again, because now you've just built a wall and you've conditioned them in a way almost to stop sharing with you. And
Yep.
now that's how you dissolve a learning organization. Now you're an army of one versus a legion.
Oh, I agree. And one thing too to note is, if you're having a one-on-one conversation, with someone that you're leading, you have to treat them like gold. You have to treat them like they're the only thing that matters
Yep.
when you're speaking to them in that moment. There's no distractions. I never answer another call or email when I'm talking to one of my guys. My focus is 100% entirely on them,
Mm.
because that really is my priority, and I have to express that to them. Um, and I think that's oftentimes I've seen leaders that will cancel a scheduled meeting, or show up late, or hop on another call when they're when they had a planned meeting with one of their guys. And I think it's prudent to be careful that, you definitely make them a priority. If you have scheduled time, or if they call you for advice or feedback, they're the only thing that's going on. When you're talking to them, that's your 100% of your focus should be on them. So
It's time for our final show segment that I like to call the Killer Bees. These are the same 4 questions that I ask every guest on the Tales of Leadership podcast. Be brief, be brilliant, be present, and be gone. Question 1. So what do you believe separates an ordinary leader from an extraordinary leader?
I'd say an extraordinary leader is able to stretch the capabilities of someone and just get an organization to operate at peak performance and make it look effortless. And I've seen this before. It's a rare quality, but just almost make it look effortless. And it's incredible to see. I hope, I'm able to do that one day. But, I'd say, I've heard charisma described as, you're expressing love and courage at the same time, love and confidence at the same time. And then true leaders, have those qualities. So
Charisma, love, and confidence.
Love and confidence, yeah, simultaneously. Yeah.
I wrote that down. That's awesome. That's great advice.
Mm-hmm.
So number 2, what is one resource that you could recommend to our listeners?
Yeah, one resource that I could recommend. There's so many, but I would say your best resource is to find a mentor, whether it be someone in your community, your church, or even, within your organization at work, that's much older than you and has served in multiple leadership positions successfully. That's going to be your best resource. And it's going to be better than any sort of book or leadership podcasts or someone pontificating about being a leader who's never done it. Your best resource is going to be to have one-on-one scheduled conversations with someone in your family or your organization who's done it successfully.
Yep. That's amazing advice. So question 3. So if you could go back in time and give your younger self a piece of advice, what would it be and why?
I would say the one piece of advice that I would impart on, my 22-year-old self would be to, I would say, look at the long-term view and have more perspective on what your 10 and 20-year goals will be. I think that's very difficult to do in your 20s. Not many people are able to do that. I've only met a handful of people who have thought that way in their 20s. But if you think in the long term, in that frame of mind, your 30s and 40s will be much better.
Dude, you and I are in the exact same boat. So like part of the coaching I do for service members and outside is discover your purpose, cast a long-term growth plan or a vision, and then take inspired action. And if I could have thought long-term, like 10 years at a time and working towards the growth to become that person in 10 years, I would be leaps and bounds better than I am right now. But the good news is I caught it in my 30s. So
absolutely. Yeah. Catching it in your 30s is not so bad.
So final question, how can our listeners find you and how can they add value to you?
I'd say the best way to find me is on LinkedIn. I think I gave you my LinkedIn profile. I check that fairly regularly. It's an easy way to get a hold of me or message me. If you want to connect for any reason. I'm passionate about helping service members find meaningful employment when they transition. In our line of work, we work with a lot of folks that are combat arms or in the special operations community. So I'm passionate about anything I can do to help, raise someone up and help them transition successfully. There's lots of good resources out there between the Skill Bridge program. There's lots of Fortune 500 companies or smaller companies like us that offer Skill Bridge programs where you can do an internship while you're still on active duty, transitioning out of retirement. I'd say, that's one way you can add value to me is just, extending our veteran network and helping other veterans be successful and finding that purpose in life that you described.
Yeah. That's beautiful, man. This is
Hmm.
probably one of my favorite podcasts because
Oh,
this
cool.
one is the most authentic. Because all it was is we were getting the ability to reconnect over a 10-year span of
I
the
know.
first time we met each other in Afghanistan to where we are right now on our leadership journeys.
Yeah, I was looking forward to this, and it was my first time on a podcast, so it's kind of cool.
Well, I'm glad it was
Yeah,
this one, brother. Thank you
yeah,
for
man.
being intentional for over an hour. This is great wisdom. And again, I'm just grateful.
Nope, me too, man.
All right, brother. Have a great night.
You too.
All right, team. It's time for our after action review. What are the top 3 takeaways you should have from this episode? The first one that I wrote down, there was a lot. I had a really hard time kind of narrowing it down to the top 3. But for the first one, I believe it's stretching others. As a leader, we're taking people on a journey. And a lot of times that's ourselves. We have to stretch ourselves to grow each day. But as a leader, we're placed in a precarious situation of where we have to demand that from other people and being able to stretch them. But there's a fine line in doing so as a leader between coming off as authoritarian and then coming off as too soft in terms of having more of a beta style leadership approach. And you have to find that fine line as a leader. How can you stretch your team within their current capacity, within the strengths that they have already, to become more talented, more producing organization? And it comes by embracing challenges. And it starts with yourself, is that if you want to grow in life, you have to go do difficult things. And then through those difficult things, you learn, you become better. And it's the same way as leading an organization with individuals. If you want to improve the organization, you have to allow them to do difficult things. You have to stretch them beyond their current capacity, but do so in a way that they're not stretched too far. A second key takeaway that you should have from today's episode is creating the environment for success. Towards the end of this podcast, we talked about the organization that you work for should make work fun. You should have fun. Think of it in terms of a normal person, right? Works 40 hours a week. Arguably, and I know for me, it's much more than 40 hours a week, but you work 40 hours a week. We use that as a baseline. Maybe it's 60, maybe it's 80, maybe it's more than that. But the point is that you're spending so much of your life in an organization, you should be having fun. And if you're not having fun, then you should create fun within your organization. So if you're a leader out there right now and you have people in your team that are unhappy at work, and they're unhappy at work for because you're always demanding, create an environment that allows for true balance. And we talked about the concept of, and balance is a word I don't necessarily like because I find it extremely hard to achieve. It's like those little toys, the little birds that perfectly balance on your finger. Life is never going to perfectly balance. And that's the point that leaders need to understand, is that it's about finding harmony. Harmony in what? Harmony in family, because we all have a family. I don't care who you are. Someone loves you. Harmony with yourself and harmony at work. People follow people. They don't follow profit. If you have that kind of mindset, is that people are objects to get more money and more profits, you're probably going to achieve temporary results, but you're going to have high turnover. If you want to have a truly extraordinary organization, you need to pull the word extra out of extraordinary, and you need to go that extra mile. You have to be able to create fun at work. And in doing so, you're going to be able to create what Jack talked through, absolute trust within an organization. So how do we build relationships? We do it through pain and repetition, right? How my drill sergeant used to tell me how you learn: pain and repetition. But if you want to create a work environment, create the type of environment that is fun. In the military, we have family readiness groups that I fully would embrace. It is a tool for me to have deliberate fun. I'm not saying have mandatory fun with your team. And there's a time and place for that, but make sure it's authentic, because when it's authentic, then you're going to be able to build that trust. And that is the glue that holds organization together, because it builds the relationships. And the final key takeaway is to create investment within the organization. And how do you do that? It's very hard to create investment within an organization. I think one of the tenets of my leadership style is accountability. And it's literally one of the values that I hold myself to: routine, accountability, and discipline. I'm going to be routine in my duties. I'm going to be accountable to myself, and I'm going to hold other people accountable. And I'm going to have the discipline to do hard things when it gets to that point in my career, in my life, in my family, and with myself. I'm going to get up every morning at 4 a.m. because I have that level of commitment and accountability to myself. But how do you build that in an organization? You do that through mission command. Mission command is a military term, and you can go read it. I think it's ADP 80RP 6-0, but it means that you're giving authority down to the lowest level possible within reason, that's ethically and morally right, to allow them to make those decisions. When you can delegate to the right people with the right skill sets, you're creating investment because you're forcing them to commit. That's the key. You're giving them a task to commit to. And if they fail, it's on them. And then you hold them accountable. And we talked about this at the beginning too, is that there's a difference between responsibilities and accountabilities. Responsibility is me as a leader. I'm responsible for my duties, the scope of my duties to perform. But when I fail, that's when I transition into accountability. So when you give someone a task, they're responsible to complete that task. And it's important to understand this as a leader. But when they fail at that task, that is when you have to hold them accountable. And I'm not saying hold them accountable through fire. Do so as a learning organization. And here's a bonus, because Ryan said it, but I'll do this one kind of quickly. And this is another beautiful takeaway. Learn how to communicate when someone messes up, so it doesn't ruin that relationship. So how do you hold them accountable in a way where it does not erode that relationship? Hey guys, if you've gotten any value out of today's podcast, I know it's a fairly long one, but there was a lot of amazing content in this. Do me a favor, subscribe, rate this podcast, and then most importantly, share it with someone who is a leader. That would be the most important thing that you could do, and it would mean the absolute world to me. You can reach out to me on any of my social media channels. Let me know how I'm doing. Give me some feedback. Let me know what you want to hear more of, and I will bring that value to you. I'm Josh McMillian, saying every day is a gift. Don't waste yours. I'll see you next time.